chapter of Lancashire life which I guess shaped our towns and changed, altered our heritage. It may not have been the happiest of situations, but I think most agree it was a significant thing. The Cotton Famine, it had a brutal impact on families here in the county, and its legacy, I suppose, can still be felt to this day. I'm pleased to say I've been joined here in the studio by Dr. Simon Rennie. Simon, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks very much for coming along. We're going to talk about the legacy through artwork, through poetry and the lyrics of the Cotton Famine. But first of all, just remind us about the salient facts, because it was seismic at the time, wasn't it?
It was, and it did shape the history of this part of the country, and was felt throughout the country, actually, economically. So the Cotton Famine was caused largely by the American Civil War and by the North's blockade of southern cotton coming from the southern states. 80% of the cotton that was worked in Lancashire came from the southern states.
And that was big industry and big business in Lancashire, wasn't it?
It was huge. It was absolutely huge. They reckoned that about 4 million people were directly or indirectly dependent on the cotton industry. That was, at the time, that was 20% of the British population.
And a lot of it in the northwest.
Yeah, huge amount of it. I mean, obviously, this is the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. So the effect on that was seismic, as you say.
And what was the effect? I mean, are we talking here levels of poverty?
Huge levels of poverty, to the extent where people did suffer from malnutrition and starvation.
So people were starving?
Yeah. There are reports of people starving. Certainly lots of vulnerable old people and child mortality rates, particularly in the winters. The winter of 1862 in particular, which was kind of, as the effects of unemployment got worse and worse, and before relief efforts started to properly kick in, certain towns suffered particularly badly.
I was reading in dispatches somewhere, I think Glossop had a way of dealing with it, and there's an Abraham Lincoln statue in the centre of Manchester. This was across the northwest, but where in Lancashire was particularly affected? Well,
Preston was badly affected. Preston, I think at one point, half of Preston's population was on relief.
Oh, goodness.
Blackburn was badly affected as well, and different towns reacted in slightly different ways. I mean, we're only looking largely at the poetry, and we see different types of poetry in different places. There's been an assumption that there wasn't a lot of kind of political resistance or political anger, as it were. But when we looked at Blackburn, myself and my co-investigator, Dr. Ruth Mather, who's actually from Blackburn, we looked at the Blackburn Times and found some poetry that was actually quite radical and quite angry.
We'll explore that research in detail over the next few minutes this Wednesday morning. But it's staggering, isn't it, that here is how global political decisions
absolutely affect
people and families on the streets, which we still wander down today.
I think that's it, and I think that this is why the research that we're uncovering and the whole thing about the Lancashire Cotton Famine resonates so much today in terms of globalisation. This is Victorian globalisation, this is really the first time that we feel the effects of this at a regional level to this extent. The poetry reveals that Lancashire people were very, very clued up about the world. They were very, very knowledgeable about the world. You
don't necessarily expect, do you?
No, and they were very literary.
We'll talk about that, certainly, in greater detail with Dr. Simon Rennie, BBC Radio Lancashire, on a Wednesday morning. BBC Radio Lancashire with me, Brett Davison, and Dr. Simon Rennie with us here in the studio, talking of the Cotton Famine and been hearing about the historical facts and people starving on the streets of Lancashire. But it is the research into the lyricism, how it was captured in poems, that has fascinated you. Tell us about the project then. How did this come about?
Well, it began, it was kind of kicked off by the BBC, actually. My partner noticed that there was a programme about the Lancashire Cotton Famine in our time on Radio 4. And we'd been talking a little bit about that, about the history of that, particularly because I'm from Manchester, and somebody said on the programme that a lot of poetry was written, and I was looking for a new project at the time. I'd just been finished writing about Chartism, about 1840s poetry, radical poetry. So my thing is working class poetry. And I started to research it, started to look for it, and found hundreds of poems in newspapers that nobody had really looked at.
And who had written these? Are these
Ordinary
on the
people.
street?
That's the wonderful thing about this.
We don't think of that, do we? Think of the Lakeland poets, maybe, and we think of, you know, people full of opium and the like. Laudanum but this is actually on the streets, and it's people who are living it.
Poetry was like the Facebook, the Twitter of the day, because people were communicating through the newspapers. That was the way that people communicated. That was the media of the day. And, you know, working class people didn't have time to write novels. We think of Victorian literature, we think of the big novels.
But Dickens, shining a light on urban deprivation.
And that's fine, but working people didn't have the time to do that. But you can write a good poem in an hour. And you can send it to your local newspaper, and you can get it published, and you can be famous. You know, lots of them.
I suppose we're probably best thinking of it in terms of song lyrics now, aren't we? It's sort of working. And did that then mean a greater community of the working class?
I think so. I think that was part of the function of the poetry, was to create. When you look at the editorial policy of the newspapers, often they would that space, the poetry column of their newspaper, was the space where they allowed working people to communicate with each other in a different way. And poetry obviously is a different thing from writing prose or writing journalistic prose. But it allows people to express their emotions. It allows people to sometimes to say things that they can't say in prose. It allows you to tell a story, a narrative, in a very compressed way.
And all the more amazing because the vast majority of these people wouldn't have had much of an education.
No.
And like you say, they're very clued into world events and how that impacts on life lived here in Lancashire.
Yeah, and people who... literacy rates were rising, but there was a great culture of people reading the newspaper to other people, and this was their window into the world. So the newspapers were incredibly important. But also... poetry was incredibly important, and the tradition of selling sheets of poetry on the streets. There were people like Samuel Laycock and Joseph Ramsbottom. These were Lancashire dialect poets. Made a living sometimes by selling the poetry on the streets.
So literally speaking people's language.
Yeah, but also some of them became famous because of the Lancashire Cotton Famine, because they were thrown out of the work in the cotton mill, so they began writing poetry about it and made some money selling the poetry.
And it's valuable, of course, for you that these things were printed and there are artefacts and they're the things you're exploring. You're okay to stay on with us, aren't you, after the news, because we need to hear actually some of this poetry as well as placing it into the context of the times and how it had an effect then, and maybe its legacy is still being felt. I'm Brett with Dr. Simon Rennie, who talking about the poetry, and we'll hear some of the poems written pertaining to the Cotton Famine. It didn't last long, did it? It was 4 years. You wouldn't know that at the time, but only 4 years?
Yeah, 4 years. It ran alongside the American Civil War. So when the cotton came back, obviously the effects of the famine were relieved, and there was some relief, and relief came from all sorts of quarters. Really, it came from the middle classes to the working classes. It came from there was big relief efforts in London to help the north, and actually some relief came from the north side of America as well. Famously came into Liverpool, So yeah, it didn't last that long, but obviously, if you were suffering it, then 3-4 years of unemployment or low hours and hunger it's a long time. Yeah,
and it's amazing again what you say about. We're talking about the health service today, and some describe that as the crowning glory of the welfare state. There wasn't a welfare system, but there was thoughts of charity, maybe even Dickensian thoughts of the milk of human kindness and people helping one another.
Well, that's a big theme in the poetry, and it's the fascinating thing about the poetry is how complex it is and how many different opinions are expressed in the poetry. Obviously, some of the poetry calls for charity. It calls for people to give, but also you get people who working class people who are ashamed of the idea of charity, and they'd rather call it aid. And there's one of the poems that we found in Blackburn, actually, in the Blackburn Times. It's called Cotton Lords, and it's an interesting poem because it wasn't actually in the poetry column. It was in an editorial, and it was used by the editor as an example of the poetry that they wouldn't publish, and that's because it was angry. And it was blaming the factory owners and suggesting that the factory owners should do more to help the workers, because when the cotton comes back, they need workers who are skilled. They need them to keep them alive, basically. And also that the workers have made them rich. And now that there's an economic downturn, they need to do their bit to help the workers.
Now, there's a recording of this, isn't there?
There is. I've worked with a fantastic folk group called Faustus, and they're working with me. We're sending them poems, and they're choosing poems to look at, and they've chosen Cotton Lords to do an arrangement of. So this is a poem that nobody's read for 150 years, and it's fantastic to hear it.
Cotton lords, lords of creation, feed the slaves which made your wealth. Is this not a Christian nation? Foods conducive to their health. Cotton lords, lords of creation, feed the slaves which made your wealth. Is this not a Christian nation? Foods conducive to their health. Though you shut your factory gates, sell your cotton, stop each loom, though war is raging in the States, the cotton tree twice yearly bloom. Cotton lords, lords of creation, feed the slaves which made your wealth. Is this not a Christian nation? Foods
Just to whet your appetite, that's a recording by Faustus of Cotton Lords, and that 150 years old.
Yeah.
And like you say, there's an anger to that. And some of the other poems would have very emotional side to it as well. Some, I imagine, a bit more reportage. There's a whole wealth, isn't there?
Absolutely. That's the thing. Is there's this huge variety. There's one of the other songs that Faustus have recorded is one called "The Lancashire Factory Girl," and that's a very sad poem. And it narrates this story of this Lancashire factory girl through poverty having to sell off all of these things that have been given to her by various members of her family, and these members of her family die through the poem. And so there are all sorts of themes there. There are themes about poverty, there are themes about death, but there are also themes about the fact that this Lancashire girl has retained her virtue through this area, and those Victorian themes that you see in Victorian novels, are all there.
Well, I know you've got another poem. You're going to share that with us in a moment and tell us about an event you've got. So this is the morning programme with me, Brett Davison, and with me in the studio, Dr. Simon Rennie, who is sharing with us some of the poems he's unearthed about the Cotton Famine. Going to tell us about an event you've got in a moment, but you've brought another poem to the airwaves as well. What's the background to this one?
Yeah, this is one that I found in Burnley when I first started looking. I found it in the Burnley Free Press and General Advertiser. It's from August 1863, and it's by a chap who calls himself Williff Cunliam, which is a very strange name. And when I did a little bit of research, I realised that this is actually somebody called William Cunliffe, and I just swapped the parts of the name around. It's called Settling the War, and I said earlier that there's a great variety in the poetry, and this one actually, strangely, made me laugh when I first read it because it's funny. It's also in dialect, which some of the poetry was. So that's why I'm going to read it in the way that I'm going to read it, and people in Lancashire will have to forgive my Mancunian phonemes when I'm trying to read a Lancashire poem, but this is how it goes. What's the matter? What's the matter? What's the ears folk all standing round? Has there somebody been fainting? Has somebody killed or drowned? No, I'd forgotten. Welly 6 months, far or near, here our Parliament's been meeting, busy settling on war. Chaps with noddles full of larning, yeds that's brasting with their wit. Here you'll find both neat and morning, gi'ing the world the benefit. So then it goes on for a couple more stanzas, and the last two stanzas. This man threpping all for Davis, to the Lincoln fair or foul. Tongs and poker, wang bang at it, spit and sputter, gurn and growl. Well, chaps, hurry up the business. Let's up fend on it's getting nar. Spout away at Nuttall's corner. Finish the job and settle the war. So,
of the streets, in the argot of the time.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. So recording
An urgency to it, wasn't
yeah, yeah, and recording didn't start till a generation after this. So this is the only time we get the chance we get to hear working people's voices.